Let's go back to June of 1977. Two men, Paul Ruiz and Earl Van Denton, slipped away from a prison work detail in McAlester, Oklahoma. Ruiz was serving life for robbery. Van Denton, already a convicted murderer, was also doing life. Once free, they didn't run to hide. They ran to kill. They stole cars, robbed for weapons, and left a trail of blood from Louisiana through Arkansas. In Louisiana, investigators later linked them to the killings of two fishermen, Ray Jones and Alton Brown. Back in Oklahoma, a cab driver named James Melvin Short was found dead. These men weren't just escapees, they were predators. By June 29th, they reached Logan County, Arkansas. That morning, magazine town marshal Marvin Ritchie radioed in a license plate check. He was never heard from again. Witnesses soon saw him handcuffed in the back of his own patrol car, driven away by strangers. Those strangers were Ruiz and Van Denton. A few hours later, two U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Rangers, David Small and Opal Lee James, happened upon them at Blue Mountain Lake. Both were overpowered. What followed was calculated and cruel. Marshal Ritchie and Ranger Small were shoved into the trunk of the patrol car. Shots were fired into that dark space. Ritchie died instantly. Small, hit in the chest, somehow clung to life. James was driven away in his own truck, shot in cold blood, and left for dead 40 miles away. His body was recovered later. That day, Logan County lost 2 men of service, and it could have been more. I remember it vividly because I was pulled into this. At the time, I was a reserve deputy in Garland County. I was dispatched to Danville in Yell County, which borders Logan. My job was to assist at a roadblock or with anything else that they needed. I rode there with State Trooper A54 Richard Loyd. Richard was a bear of a man, but his voice was something else, a deep baritone that could roll out like thunder. He was a stalwart in his church choir, and he carried that faith with him everywhere. That day, though, it was more than faith we carried. I was armed with a .30 caliber carbine rifle in addition to my sidearm. Richard had a riot shotgun across his lap and his own sidearm at the ready. We knew we might meet Ruiz and Van Denton on those roads, and we knew if we did, it would end in a gunfight. Because these men were killers, they had nothing to live for, nothing to lose. The road from Hot Springs to Danville twisted through hills and narrow blacktop. Richard drove it like a NASCAR driver, hammering through curves while I tried to hang on, and all the while, over the roar of the engine and the rattle of gravel, Richard sang gospel hymns, loudly, one after another, Blessed Assurance, Amazing Grace, and then in full voice, Nearer My God to Thee. Now I'll tell you, that gave me some pause. That was the song they say the Titanic's band played as the ship went down. Here we were, racing to catch two killers, and Richard was singing a funeral hymn. But that was him, a man whose faith was louder than fear. We never crossed paths with Ruiz and Van Denton that day. 9 days later, they were caught in Portland, Oregon, armed and dangerous, but finally cornered. Back in Arkansas, they stood trial. On April 27, 1978, a Logan County jury found both men guilty of capital murder. They were sentenced to die. Appeals and legal wrangling dragged on for nearly 2 decades, but on January 8, 1997, the state of Arkansas carried out their executions at the Cummins unit. Justice came slowly, but it came. Marshal Marvin Ritchie never made it home. Ranger Opal Lee James never made it home. Other victims along their bloody path didn't either, but Richard and I did. That night, by the grace of God, we made it home, and I'll never forget that twisting ride to Danville. The sight of Richard gripping the wheel, a riot gun across his lap, and his deep baritone voice filling the patrol car with gospel songs. This is the kind of story I bring to a coroner's memory. These pieces are an overview, a mix of history, my personal thoughts, and my own involvement if I had one. If you want the deepest dives, the intense investigations, the full case files pulled apart piece by piece, then join us over at the Coroner's Report podcast. That's where we go all in. And as always, y'all be kind to each other, okay?